Okay, so let's look at this piece holistically. So we understand what she's trying to do because we've identified the thesis. We know that Frye is trying to make a careful distinction about the concept of oppression. Right? So Frye is a philosopher of language who is retired from Michigan State University, by the way. She works now in social work. She's in her 70s, but she went back for a master's in social work, and she actually works at the Women's Center in Lansing. So she's a very interesting person and philosopher. You can see by her writing, I think, that she's a very careful writer as a philosopher of language. She pays a great deal of attention to language, and you could probably glean that from her very clear writing style. At any rate, she's concerned here about understanding what the concept of oppression means so that we can have a very careful tool to use to identify instances of oppression. So she wants to make sure that we have this clear and careful concept of oppression so that the term is not rendered meaningless, because we need the concept. We need the concept if we're going to identify particular instances of oppression in our lives, right? So one of the primary points she makes at the outset is that people in groups can suffer without being oppressed. Now, we're often charged, by we I mean women, particularly feminists who want to talk about gender oppression, we're often painted as denying that others suffer, that males can't suffer. But the fact is that in being clear about what the word oppression means is not to say that others don't suffer. It's to make a distinction between suffering, limitations, obstacles, and this particular term, oppression. And Frye is concerned especially with gender oppression here, but we'll be talking about various forms of oppression throughout the course, and this concept holds steadily for the most part in terms of what Frye is trying to say about the concept of oppression. So she's saying that, look, if women deny that others suffer, then we're told we're being insensitive by trying to preserve the term oppression for ourselves, which ends up negating one of the few virtues that women are actually allowed to have. We're supposed to be sympathetic. We're supposed to be sensitive, caring, right? These are some of the feminine virtues that have been applied to us historically. And so, if we're not sensitive to the suffering of others, then there's an implication that we may not, in fact, be real women, right? So we're silenced before we even get to talk about our oppression because our situation of being oppressed has completely lost meaning. If we want to say that, oh, everyone's oppressed, or, I'm sure you've heard people use this term in very sort of not careful ways, right? Oh, this weather is so oppressive. That may be true in a sense, but what Frye is trying to do here is to make sure that we can retain the meaning of the concept so that we can talk about our experience of oppression. Otherwise, as she says, we do become silenced before we can even talk about the oppression, because our situation of oppression, in particular gender oppression here, has lost all meaning. It's just one other form of suffering. Interestingly, Frye is going to give us here what she considers to be the necessary and sufficient conditions of oppression. And you'll want to keep this in mind. Although she does mention things like race, class, age, ability, sexuality, she kind of lumps all women into one category. And keep this in mind as we go forward with the readings, because she's telling us, want to know what gender oppression is? Okay, well, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to give you the necessary and sufficient conditions. If some situation meets these necessary and sufficient conditions, then it's an instance of oppression. If it doesn't meet these necessary and sufficient conditions, then it's not an instance of oppression. So the three necessary and sufficient conditions that she's giving us here, individually these are necessary conditions, the three together being sufficient conditions for oppression, are first that oppression is macroscopic, or it's systematic and can be seen from only a macroscopic perspective. Second, that it's targeted towards particular groups of people and members of particular groups of people. So gender oppression is targeted towards women, racial oppression towards persons of color or possibly ethnicities, and oppression based on disability is targeted towards members of disabled groups. Oppression based on age is targeted at members of groups who are older or possibly younger. Oppression based on sexuality is targeted at persons who are generally non-normatively heterosexual. So that's the second condition. And the third condition is that the relation to the barrier is contextual. So the first condition is that oppression is systematic. The second condition is that oppression is targeted towards members of groups. And the third condition is that there's a contextual relationship to a particular barrier, right? And so we'll go through and talk about each of these three things that Frye suggests. So let's talk first about the condition that oppression is systematic, it's structural, and can be seen only from a macroscopic position. So again, Frye, being a philosopher of language, goes right at the word oppression to try to get a handle on clarifying what we mean by oppression. And she mentions how the root of oppression is press, to press. And to press implies reducing, immobilizing, or molding into shape. So you might think of press as reducing, as something like the French press if you're a coffee drinker. The French press reduces, right? You can see it presses on the coffee beans. It immobilizes, right? To press is to immobilize. You might think of the press of the crowd, as she mentions, or a full court press for sports fans. Or pressing also means molding into shape. So you might think of pressing a shirt, or as she says, I think a pair of slacks, right? Or pressing on Play-Doh. So oppressed persons often experience, as we said, the double bind, which requires them to choose to be either pleasant and comply, rendering them invisible, or to refuse to comply and to be punished and suffer harm. So the double bind occurs when there are systematically related pressures that limit options to just a few, all of which expose one to penalties, censure, or deprivation. So the experience of being oppressed is like being caged in. So she uses this image of the bird cage, which is very important. And so there are these non-accidental barriers that are systematically related to each other so as to catch one in and between them, restricting and penalizing motion. Looking at one obstacle or one wire, it's not obvious that one is being systematically restricted. Only a macroscopic view of the cage, of the network or system of oppressions, system of forces working together, allows one to see why the bird is immobilized and restricted. So, for example, she gives us the example of the male door opening ritual. Now, I do want to clarify by this, what she's not saying is that any time a male opens a door for a female, it's oppressive. That's not at all what Frye is suggesting here. Frye is a very radical feminist, but that's not at all what she's suggesting. She's talking about the tradition or the ritual in which males feel that they ought to always open doors for females simply because they are male and females are female. So this ritual, which is a bit less practiced today than it has been, but it's still out there. I experience this all the time. And as she says, even if the man is busy going somewhere else, has his hands full, oftentimes men feel that it's their duty to open the door for a woman, even if she's able-bodied, without packages in her hands and fully capable of opening the door. So what she says about the male door opening ritual is that we can see this as one of those wires of the birdcage, which if we just looked microscopically at that one event, that one practice, right, the male door opening ritual, it would be like looking at one wire of the birdcage, and we wouldn't see it as restrictive, as immobilizing, because that one obstacle wouldn't be if it were only that one obstacle. However, because it works systematically with other obstacles or wires of the birdcage, it works to oppress women. It pretends to be a helpful service, but the helpfulness is false because it's done whether it's helpful or not. Right? It may not actually be helpful for a man to stumble ahead and say, "Oh, hold on, let me get that for you," when the woman could just open the door and possibly hold it open for the man who has packages in his hand. Frye says that under the guise of helpfulness, this is done in counterpoint with patterns of refusal to help when women actually need help. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence for this. I'll put some links up here to just a few of the cases where this has happened, but the most famous case, not the most recent, but the most famous is the case of Kitty Genovese. But there have been several instances of this happening. There are many cases of these gallant gestures, which are symbolic and imply that women are incapable and dependent, and that their needs and interests are irrelevant, while at the same time, when someone actually needs help, when a woman actually needs help, men are somehow absent. And again, the Kitty Genovese story is horrific, right? This woman was raped for hours, and apparently neighbors saw or had an inkling that at least that this was happening and never bothered to call the police. And there have been several instances of this happening within the last few years. I'll put up a few links here and you can check these stories out. One that happened in a New York subway, one that happened 2 or 3 years ago in California, where a teenage girl was just brutally gang raped, and just dozens and dozens of people stood by and watched it happen. In fact, laughed, took pictures, right? And there's no doubt in my mind that some of the men standing around in the crowd sort of joining in and laughing and taking pictures while this woman, this teenage girl, really was being gang raped. And there's no doubt in my mind that some of the men that participated in this that watched this happen, encouraged it to happen, didn't get help, that some of those men would be the same men who would practice this male door opening ritual. Right? So we have on the one hand this practice, this social practice of chivalry on the male's part of opening a door for a woman. Well, at the same time, when she's in need, Frye says she needs help around the house with housework or getting dinner on the table or maybe editing a manuscript, or in the most extreme case, when she's being raped by another man or gang raped by other men, that's when she needs help. If the helpfulness is really what's at stake here, it doesn't seem like opening doors for women is really the appropriate place to exercise that virtue, right? So on Frye's view, these are just sort of symbolic gestures of chivalry that imply that women are incapable and dependent on men. And in fact, the things that we actually need, men aren't interested in helping with. In order to see this, though, we have to take this kind of macroscopic view. Otherwise, if we just think, oh, it's a guy opening a door for me, I mean, that's just what guys do, that's just how it is, then we're not seeing this from a macroscopic perspective. We're just seeing microscopically that, hey, it's just a thing. That's not oppressive. Frye's going to say, no, actually, if we step back and look at this macroscopically, we'll see how that's tied in to many other obstacles as a system of making women dependent on men. And we'll see later in another reading, a reading by McKinnon, where the sort of these chivalrous sort of protections and the chivalrous gallant helpfulness to women is not unrelated to sexual violence and rape culture. But that's in another reading, but note that looking forward. Okay, so that's the first condition. The first necessary condition is that oppression is systematic, and we have to take a macroscopic perspective in order to see it. The next condition that she talks about is that oppression is targeted. Oppressed persons are oppressed because they are members of a particular group. Right? Gender oppression happens to women. Women are oppressed because they are a member of the group women. In our society in the United States, blacks are oppressed through racial oppression because they are a member of the group blacks. Lesbians are oppressed because they're lesbians. Gay men because they're gay men. Chicanas because they're Chicanas. Asians because they're Asians. The disabled because they're disabled, and so on and so forth. So to recognize someone as oppressed is to recognize them as belonging to some particular oppressed group. So on Frye's view, individuals are not oppressed as such. Individuals are only oppressed as members of some identity group. So segregation is one way that you can define a group as a group. But all groups are not segregated, and especially women. So this can make it difficult to take a macroscopic perspective on oppressed groups. In fact, with women this is difficult, and this will come up again, at least in the Beauvoir reading. But women are dispersed and assimilated into other groups, racial groups, class groups, ethnic groups, which organize men. So many people don't recognize the group women as oppressed because we're dispersed. We're divided practically, economically, sexually for the most part, making it difficult to recognize group oppression. Women are sort of politically tied to the men to whom they're married. Yet, Frye wants to argue that women are a group due to their function in the service of men and men's interests. So it's important to see that when someone is oppressed, they're oppressed as a member of a particular group. Right? So this is the second necessary condition. The third necessary condition is that oppressed persons are oppressed in a contextual relationship to some barrier. So all human beings suffer frustration, harm, limitation, yet social structures that impose limitations and boundaries are distinct from structures of oppression. Right? Only some suffering and harm is due to oppression. When one is oppressed, one does suffer harm, but not all suffering and harm is oppressive. Right? So you have to look at the context macroscopically to see whether the structure itself is oppressive. So, for example, she gives several examples here. One is the example of the white playboy diamond investing skier who has an accident. Right? He's suffering if he falls on the ski slopes and breaks his leg and ends up lying there for hours. He is suffering, but he's not being structurally oppressed because, again, he's not a member of an oppressed group, and that's not why he's being harmed. If we look at it macroscopically, there's no system of oppressive barriers working together that forced him to fall down and break his leg. And his relation to the barrier of getting help is not one that is structured purposefully to keep him from getting help. Another example that she gives is there are lots of social structures, right? Language, all kinds of rules, whether ethical, practical, right? Traffic laws that we have to follow. These are limitations. These are barriers, right, to what we can do. In our society, we drive on the right side of the road in the United States. But because that's a limitation, and it is a limitation, right? We ought to drive on the right side of the road, not the left. It limits us. We can't drive on the left side of the road unless we're passing. But this is not oppressive because this barrier is not set up systematically to harm or limit or immobilize some particular group of persons in a systematic way. Right? So the relationship to the boundary of the driving on one side of the road is not oppressive. Similarly, she gives the example of a prison. Right? There's a boundary there, prison walls. And she does say that even though those prison walls both keep prisoners in, right, and keep people from the outside out, it's only oppressive to those who are inside the prison walls. So people inside the prison walls have a different relationship to the barrier than people on the outside. Even though there's a barrier for both, the walls are put in place systematically to keep those people inside the prisons inside, to keep them immobilized, right, restricted. But they're not there for the restriction or immobilization of the people on the outside. They're actually put in place to protect the people on the outside, for the benefit of the people on the outside. So one is not oppressed because one's life is affected by some barrier or some unpleasant encounter. So Frye suggests that we ask who constructs and maintains the barrier, whose interests are served by the barrier, and is the barrier part of a structure that confines or reduces or immobilizes some group? And am I a member of that group? Right? So many practices of restriction and limitation are internalized and self-monitored, so we must ask who benefits from the practices and who imposes the penalties. For example, men can cry in the company of women, but they can't cry in the company of men. Right? This is often brought up as a counterexample to Frye's argument. But, as Frye argues, this is a requirement of men, right? For the benefit of men, rewarded with esteem from other men. So this can't be considered gender oppression, that women don't feel that they can cry in the company of other men, right? Because this is a rule made by men, for the benefit of men. Women don't benefit from this. Right? Women don't enforce this. However, women's cramped physical postures and short stride is relaxed in the presence of other women. But it's practiced strongly in the company of men because it's required by men. But it's not rewarded with esteem. It doesn't benefit us. In fact, it announces our membership in an oppressed group. There's some interesting work done on this. There's actually a lot of interesting work done on this. One of the popular essays that talks about this that unfortunately we won't be reading, but you're welcome to seek that out and let me know if anybody would like it. I probably have it, is Iris Marion Young's Throwing Like a Girl, where she talks about how because we are so often immobilized and caged in, we physically keep our body closer to itself, right? You can see the difference in how men stand. They kind of really spread themselves out, right? Spread out their legs, spread out their arms on the counter, whereas women sit, right, a little closer with their legs crossed usually. And she talks about how throwing like a girl is not something inherent about the female body. There's nothing about the female skeletal, muscular system that prevents women from throwing in a more open way with a stronger follow-through. It's because we've been taught socially to keep our bodies sort of held in, oppressed, pressed in, molded in a particular way. That's why girls throw like girls. It has nothing to do with their physical or biological body, lack of muscles, right? It's completely a social phenomenon that girls throw like a girl. There's some other interesting work on this, but the idea here is that, as Frye was saying, our cramped postures and our short stride is something that's enforced by men. And so it's part of the system of gender oppression. Whereas a man crying is also enforced by men. Right? That's not part of gender oppression. Now, sure, is there something wrong with our ideals of masculinity? I think Frye would probably not disagree with that. But what Frye would say is that the issues with masculinity, where men don't feel as though they can cry in the presence of other men, is not oppressive, because it's not something that's enforced by women for the benefit of women. Rather, it's enforced by men for the benefit of men. And men are given esteem when they live up to this sort of masculinity. So those are the three necessary conditions that together give us the necessary and sufficient conditions for oppression on Frye's view. And finally, Frye argues that when you're part of an oppressed group, it marks you for oppressive pressures. So being a woman is a factor in the kind of job I can have and the kind of money I can make. It makes me a likely victim of sexual assault. It reduces my anger, oftentimes, to insanity or irrationality. It affects the disadvantages and deprivations one suffers as a woman. However, this is not the case when one is a man. Maleness is always something that someone has going for them, even if their race, their class, their age, or disability is working against them. So women are oppressed as women. Right? And this is the basis of gender oppression, that women are oppressed as women. If you guys have comments, additions, questions, concerns, please do go ahead and post those today on the discussion board on D2L, and I'll be happy to see what you guys thought of this essay, and we'll go from there.